where we've seen protest activity for several days. More is expected later today in the area. You can see police behind me gathering, as well as protesters in the park. This is the scene during the day, Judy. At night, it's a different story. I was covering a protest last night around Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan. The police allowed protesters to continue marching after the 8 p.m. curfew. At 9 o'clock, however, there was a very swift and sudden change. Police in riot gear rushed the crowd, and they began arresting people at random, seemingly grabbing them out of the ground, police officers tackling them to the ground, and that is sort of what we're seeing at night after people are out after the curfew.
Dan, we know in New York City there have been questions for a long time over the years about police, about possible overuse of force, if you will. What are you hearing from the protesters about what they're seeing?
So the protesters here in the nation's largest city, just like in other cities around the country, are out expressing their anger, their frustration, their pain at the way that they're treated by police. And let's take a listen here at one woman's comments about why she's out protesting.
I want to see change. I want to see, like, you know, I can't go outside at night with a hoodie on and not be profiled in the South Bronx and get, you know, ran up on by 6 detective cops because they want to just search me to think, or, you know, they think I'm someone, you know, a suspect for something. It's like you have a daily fear of your life for no reason.
That was a young man there, Judy, talking about his fear, his frustrations with the police, and that's what protesters are telling me here. They want concrete change.
And just quickly, Dan, what about political leaders? What are they saying about New York?
That's right, Judy. President Trump has criticized Governor Cuomo, Mayor de Blasio for not cracking down harder. Governor Cuomo also criticized de Blasio. The mayor, however, has said he does not want the National Guard here. This city has the largest police force in the country with 36,000 officers. The mayor is saying he thinks he can get this under control, these nighttime protests, he says, in the coming days. So we'll see what happens.
Dan Bush reporting for us tonight from Brooklyn. Thank you, Dan. The nation's capital has been another site of large-scale protests. Washington, D.C.'s Mayor Muriel Bowser said today that she wants out-of-state National Guard troops out of the District of Columbia. And the mayor joins us now. Mayor Bowser, thank you very much for being here. It's reported that protesters are gathering in the streets of Washington at this hour. This would be the 7th straight day of protests. You have opted not to impose a curfew, though. Why not?
Judy, we situationally review what our public safety needs are to manage protests. And we have seen over the last 2 nights very peaceful protests. In fact, we have seen the number of people coming down to demonstrate in front of the White House swell quite a bit ever since peaceful protesters were forcibly moved out of the way by the federal police. So people have come down to peaceably protest and police themselves in some ways. So if they see somebody who is not there for a peaceful protest and bent on destruction, we've seen the crowds deal with them.
Do you get some kind of advance word from the organizers of these protests about what their intentions are? How do you get intelligence about what's going on?
Well, sometimes people who organize frequently in Washington, D.C. will reach out to our Metropolitan Police Department or to our Homeland Security Department and give us a heads up. Other times, we're listening to intelligence, monitoring social media so that we have a good gauge on how many people are coming and how many staff we need to manage traffic, close streets, and make sure people are safe. We think this Saturday we're going to have a larger crowd in D.C., and we'll make some determinations about what we need in terms of staffing and if we need to reinstate a curfew on that day.
Who has control, Mayor Bowser, of keeping the peace in Washington, D.C.? Is it the D.C. police, or is it the National Guard, some of the troops that have come in from elsewhere?
Well, you're highlighting the unique status of Washington, D.C. We're the capital city. We're a federal district. We're 700,000 federal, 700,000 tax-paying Americans. And I'm the mayor, governor, county executive all at once. But because we are not a state, the federal government can encroach on our autonomy and bring in federal forces to protect federal assets. And that's what we see in D.C. I am the mayor. We have a police force of 4,000 men and women who protect D.C. every single day, who support First Amendment demonstrations, and the police chief and that force report to me.
So you were critical, Mayor, earlier this week when President Trump, his administration ordered the clearing out of peaceful protesters around the White House so that the president could walk over to St. John's Church, that scene where he had his photograph taken holding the Bible. And yet the federal government does have control over that area, does it not?
The federal government and everybody who works for it swears an oath to the Constitution of the United States that allows Americans to peaceably protest, to exercise their First Amendment rights. And what I witnessed, from what I could see, what I think the world could see, is that those people were peaceably protesting. And the specter of federal police or other, releasing munitions to clear the way so the president could make a political statement is abhorrent.
And are you getting a sense right now that the administration is going to hold back in some way? It's being prepared to deploy federal troops. Are you getting any sort of signal through your communication with the White House, with the Justice Department?
Well, let me say this. We, first of all, think that there is a legal question about the president's ability to call in out-of-state National Guard into the District of Columbia, Guard that I have not requested as mayor. And we push back very hard on that. They need to deal with that question, and that we think there's some other steps that the president needs to take to do that. We don't know on whose authority that these troops are acting. And this is a similar question that was raised by the Speaker of the House to the President in a letter today. What we know, and has been announced by the Secretary of the Army, is that the active duty military troops, Army personnel who were staged around Washington, D.C., are being sent back to their home base, to their home stations.
And does that give you peace of mind? Are you confident they won't be called back again?
We can't have peace of mind in Washington, D.C. until we have full autonomy and we're just like every other American and we become the 51st state. But you asked me if that makes me feel good, if that makes me feel secure. I don't think any American can feel secure if they watch the President of the United States move on American citizens with active duty military troops.
Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. Mayor Bowser, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we would ask all of you to please join us Friday night, tomorrow night, for Race Matters, America in Crisis, a PBS NewsHour primetime special. At the end of this difficult week, we explore this anguished moment and how we move ahead. Over the past few days, as protesters have taken to the streets, the president's talk about using military force on the demonstrators has generated a backlash among a number of former senior military officers. The Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have also been criticized for their actions and what they have said. Nick Schifrin has that story.
Judy, that criticism has become a chorus, and unlike the last few months, it's all on the record. Take a look at this statement from James Mattis, retired Secretary of Defense. Militarizing our response, as we witnessed in Washington, D.C., sets up a conflict, a false conflict, between the military and civilian society. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, criticized the current Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper's words, writing, quote, "America is not a battleground. Our fellow citizens are not the enemy." And recently retired Commander of Special Operations Command, General Tony Thomas, wrote, "The battle space of America? Not what America needs to hear." To talk about this, I'm joined by retired Army General Carter Ham, who over his 38-year career commanded troops in Iraq, ran U.S. Army Europe, and U.S. Africa Command. General Ham, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you very much. Why is there so much criticism and fear among retired officials, but also some current officials who I'm talking to, about the idea of sending active duty troops into the United States?
Well, thanks, Nick. It's a great question, and in our nation, we have a long tradition, going back to the founding of the nation, of concern, even expressed in the Declaration of Independence and certainly in the Constitution, a concern about the employment of federal active duty armed forces within the boundaries of the United States for domestic security purposes. And so I think that's what we're seeing play out, is that long-held tradition of concern about using the military inside the U.S. The U.S. Armed Forces exist to protect the nation. They're not well suited for policing communities.
There's been a lot of criticism, as Judy mentioned in the introduction to this segment, of the leadership of the military. And let's go back to Monday evening. President Trump walks out of the White House. With him is Secretary Esper, and Secretary Esper ends up in a photo op in front of a burned-out church. Now, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, had been in that group, but he hung back while that photo op happened. Do you believe Milley was concerned about the idea of the military being dragged into politics if someone like him ended up in that photo op?
So all of the secretaries of defense and chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff with whom I have had the privilege of serving have all worked very, very hard to keep from politicizing the armed forces of the United States for understandable purposes. And I think largely have been successful in that regard. And so I think when it became apparent that Monday evening's events were intended for a political purpose, I think it was appropriate for the senior ranking officer of the armed forces to not participate in that.
Do you believe over the last 3+ years it's been harder for the military to stay out of politics and be seen to stay out of politics?
Well, it's always hard because the decisions regarding the employment of armed forces have an inherently political aspect to them, and so that makes it quite difficult. That to me is very different than using the military for exclusively political purposes. So it is challenging even in the best of times, and I think certainly as we've seen over the past few weeks, it has been difficult, particularly on Monday evening. I think difficult for the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to work hard to keep from politicizing the military. You know, that trust that America has in its armed forces is well earned and, in my opinion, richly deserved, but it's fragile. And so I think the leaders of the military, both civilian and military, understand that and work very, very hard to make sure that nothing interferes in that bond of trust that must exist between the nation and its armed forces.
General, I want to take you back to Tuesday after that photo op. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, wrote this memo. He sent it to the combatant commanders, the